Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Tariq Hafeez. I'm a co-founder and co-CEO of LegalEase Solutions. And today I'm delighted to have a couple of very dear guests with me here today. Andrew Downs, who is the founder of Catylex, and we're going to learn a lot more about his background and what got him into the legal tech space. And Jeff Sipos, who is general counsel of Clarion Capital. And Jeff has also had a lot of interest in legal tech, and we're going to hear his thoughts around that as well. Just curious, Jeff, where are you joining us from today?
I'm here in glamorous suburban New York and New Jersey. We are work from home on Fridays, which is delightful since yesterday half of New York was shut down to commuters, and I spent 6 hours on the train. So glad it's Friday, Tarek.
That's right. And Andrew, how about yourself? Where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from sunny Delray Beach, Florida. So I've
Ah,
commuted to my office and experienced no shutdowns over the last couple of days. But
excellent.
we're based in New York, so I'm frequently between here and there.
Okay, awesome, awesome. And I am here in a somewhat dreary Metro Detroit. So all the leaves have fallen off the trees, and winter is lurking in the corner here. So just behind, it's a couple more days, probably we're going to get into the winter weather, but it is all good. Thanks again for joining. And I'd love to kind of maybe start off with you, Andrew. Uh, you have a pretty interesting background, sort of having practiced law at a law firm setting. You've also practiced, or you've also been at a hedge fund, and you ultimately started your own legal tech company. So maybe take us through kind of a little bit about your background and where you come from and how you got to the helm of Catylex.
Sure. Um, so I'm originally Australian, so I went to law school in Australia, and after getting qualified, followed the usual route for young Australian lawyers to London. But on the way, I got a little bit waylaid. I ended up getting a job as an associate at Baker and McKenzie in Prague, um, and that was a really interesting time. And this was in sort of 95 to 98. Um, and I found myself sort of running deals that I'd never would have run if I'd been in Sydney or New York or London in terms of M&A deals and financing deals. I was also flying around and doing some privatizations in Kazakhstan. And in the course of, everything was very, very deal oriented. So I was drafting, reviewing, negotiating lots of large, complicated contracts with help, thank God, and input from some of the partners in London and New York. Um, but this was my first taste of the absolute pain of dealing with long, complicated documents. But then ultimately, after a couple of years of doing that, I got recruited by Credit Suisse First Boston in London to go over there and support their emerging market business, where CSFB was a leader at the time. And unfortunately for me, not long after I joined in '98, Russia defaulted. So that was my first intense large fire drill involving tight deadlines, lots of docs, and high values at risk. Um, so that was the first sort of baptism by fire. We were pulling sort of, all-nighters day after day after day, trying to work out what we're supposed to do in terms of unwinding, lots of credit linked notes. There were, the ruble wasn't convertible. The whole thing was it was a pretty complicated default. Um, so I spent time also with CSFB in Japan and New York before, after a couple of years moving to New York City to cover Latin America and ended up covering that and structured finance and fixed income derivatives. The next fire drill was the Argentina default. I always seem to be in these seats for these large defaults. Again, lots of docs, tight deadlines, high value at risk, extremely expensive, and chewed up just hours and hours of internal and external lawyer time. And in addition, working in-house at a large sort of financial institution, you've got your fire drills, you've got new deals, and then you've also got the constant stream of ordinary course questions, whether it's from trading, sales, credit risk operations, or any of the other many departments that kept us busy. Um, I then, after that, moved to a front office role and went to UBS. where I was originally in a role called transaction risk management, which was, working for the head of the businesses in fixed income, and ended up as the chief operating officer for the global credit businesses. So that included all the trading, origination, and structured credit businesses, and ultimately also as the COO for fixed income, currencies, and commodities for the Americas. Unfortunately, I was in that global CEO of the credit businesses seat for 2008, which was by far the biggest, most painful fire drill of them all. And that's where it was crazy. And notwithstanding the fact that we and every other bank and large asset manager was throwing money at external counsel to get all the document review we needed done, it was impossible to review all the docs. And the way that there were a lot of derivatives and repos and a lot of other documentation, which, if you have a default event or other trigger event, whether it's a NAV trigger or whatever, you have to close out that agreement and all the transactions under those agreements very quickly. And I think in the end, we had human eyes looked at 10% of the population of documents because that was all that was possible. And then we closed out and acted as if that 10% was representative of the whole population, knowing full well that it wasn't, and knowing also that we'd be in litigation for years. And that's exactly what happened. And not just at UBS, but across the street. The
Wow.
next thing I went and did was co-found a hedge fund with some folks that I knew. I was multi-hatted as the COO, CRO, CCO, and GC. Um, there are a lot of responsibilities, but I was enduring the pain in relation to documents. So I couldn't escape it no matter what I've done. It's been there. We had many, many investor side letters. We had all of our fund docs. We had a Cayman master feeder, quite a few, separately managed accounts, and all the rest of the documents associated with that. We also were participating in, a 40 Act multi-manager fund and a UCITS vehicle that GSAM were running. And then we had all our trading agreements, PB agreements, ISDAs, futures agreements, et cetera, and then all the vendor agreements. And we constantly be asked by investors coming in doing due diligence on us before they invested, how we were managing to comply with all of our obligations under the side letters, training agreements, et cetera. And I would show them a redacted versions of spreadsheets that, had kind of key must-have data, which, for the most part was satisfactory for their due diligence purposes. And there wasn't really another way to deal with it at that time. But what I knew at that time was that there were lots of other data that we hadn't captured in those spreadsheets, simply because it was too expensive in terms of human time to capture that data. And so if a serious issue occurred, we're going to be back into the details of the docs, spending a lot of time and money just to know what sort of shape we were in, depending on the issue of the day. And there wasn't really another way to do it. So that was okay. So lots and lots of struggles over my career with documents. The other thing, though, that I had done, both at UBS and also in the hedge fund was either presiding over or building trading systems with developers. And as part of that at the hedge fund, I ended up sort of coding in R and applying machine learning analytics, looking at the time series in terms of the performance of our human portfolio managers. And what we're trying to do is predict on any day whether a portfolio manager would be more or less likely to be successful in the terms of the P&L for the day. And what we're trying to do then is scale them up or down without them knowing it. Anyway, that's a whole other story. But what I found was I really enjoyed the coding, got very interested in the application of the technology. And then when we shut down the fund after about 6 years or so, I thought it'd be interesting to apply the tech to try and address the consistent and never-ending pain that I'd have over my whole career with legal docs. So I ended up founding Catylex with David Rosen, who I had hired originally out of Cleary when I was at CSFB in New York, and who had ended up at Bridgewater spending a lot of time on the problem of organizing data from legal docs. So that's how I got to where I am now.
And how long has Catylex been around for? And
We've been up and running for 6 years.
okay, so you started right around COVID times, or maybe right before COVID?
Just before COVID.
Just before COVID.
So
Okay.
it was an interesting time to start.
I'm sure there's some really interesting stories around that as well. But I'd love to sort of ask Jeff if you could also maybe tell us a little bit about your background, Jeff, and how you find yourself, at Clearing Capital as general counsel.
Sure. Thanks, Tariq. So, as Andrew was going through his background, it struck me how many commonalities there are in the tracks that the two of us have taken. It's pretty remarkable. So some of this might sound like a rerun.
That's awesome.
I'm just a few years behind him, but I hit a lot of the same stops. So I came out of law school and started in big law firms, right? I worked at what was then called Lord Bissell and Brooke, that's merged about four times since then, and Kirkland and Ellis. And I spent my time in those firms. At first you start out in the early years doing diligence. I was working in M&A teams. I was working in general corporate teams. I was working in acquisition finance teams at Kirkland. And there's a lot of diligence that gets done at that stage, right? That's where you learn, right? Your first assignments as a junior lawyer, and in some firms you can get trapped for a long time. And similar to what Andrew was saying on deals, someone had to used to go to the office of the company and sit there going through boxes, looking for consent to change of control provisions and consent to assignment provisions, and then going after all the counterparties to get those consents. It was very block and tackle work, work that now is done, with AI and other big data search tools, very easily. But that was the start. Also, like Andrew, I found myself in a deal team that was doing an unusual kind of very small corner of the insurance transactional world at a young age. And as a result of that, ended up, I wouldn't say managing deals, but kind of second sharing deals a few years earlier than I probably would have, if I was doing, different kinds of business. And that was a tremendous opportunity for a kind of head start on not just the legal work, although it certainly was that, but just the deal management, right? There's a lot of logistical work that goes into managing the process and managing the people and managing, obviously, as Andrew said, the tremendous volume of documents that comes from that. And if you're going to do a good job, you become a bit of it's almost like being a consultant where you're looking for efficiencies constantly. You're looking for you're looking for ways to manage the huge volume of data that Andrew's describing in all of his stops. It's very similar, and get your arms around it. I remember somebody told me once that a good junior associate is like, they have similar skills in some ways, not the only skills, but to a really good paralegal, right? You need to understand the docs back and forth and how you can work effectively with them. It's just really, really critical. And the good mid-level and senior associates, I think, have done that. So I was in big firms, and then also like Andrew, this is similarity number two. I found myself recruited by two clients within the same month. One of them was Credit Suisse, actually. So very similar track. I actually didn't go to Credit Suisse. I took the other job offer, which was at a financial product subsidiary of D.E. Shaw that had been sold to KBC Bank in Belgium. And did a series of kind of insurance linked investing. A lot of my work in private practice had been related to the insurance world. So at that time, I took a job that was kind of, I had one foot in the front office in doing deals and one foot in the legal department, although I sat on the trading desk, and was someone who was highly commercially minded, but understood how to manage and negotiate deal terms, which is a really nice pet to have on a structured deal desk. So I spent a few years doing that. Strangely, I can also relate to Andrew about the crisis. I think I landed on that trading desk in May of '07, which was not the best timing to leave private practice for Wall Street, but that's the way it worked out. It worked out very well for me, actually. Our business was uncorrelated, and we did just fine through the crisis. But the rest of the bank didn't do phenomenally well. Our parent entity had about a $6 billion hole in their balance sheet where the CDOs used to be, which is a problem. So after a few years, we kind of helped them sell off their non-core businesses like ours that were still profitable. And I was at that time actually recruited. So this was 2012 or 13. Was recruited to my current firm, Clarion Capital Partners. Clarion is at the time was about a 15 or 20-year-old PE shop, middle market PE. And I was at Clarion for about 3.5 years doing fundraising and fund formation and advising on insurance linked investing. From there, I left my current firm and then became deputy GC of a company called ProSite, which is a private equity owned specialty insurance business in the US, Bermuda, and London. So spent a lot of time in London, like Andrew as well, and was there and was about to take over as GC there when I was recruited by another private equity owned insurance business called Ascot, and took over as general counsel, chief legal officer there. Both those insurance businesses were, they're PE businesses, but they were growth stage, very fast accelerating businesses, for better and for worse, with all that comes with that, right? It's a wonderful place to be career-wise and professionally. As a GC, it brings a lot of challenges, right? There's a natural friction between the need to grow fast and the need to be careful on the legal front. And so the job, it's very different from leading a department in a mature company where the processes are built and they're established and the business is what it is. When you're in a fast growing company, particularly one owned by PE, you need to be agile and you need to be very comfortable issue spotting and building processes where they don't exist and knowing how to manage those processes and call on the experts to make sure you're doing it right without interfering with your commercial issues. When I was GC there, the motto that I set for the department, and I used to put it on the screen all the time when we would have meetings, was the motto was get the business where it's trying to go, dot, 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 safely. And we would talk about that most of the time. Your job is not to explain legal issues to your clients. They don't care and they shouldn't. That's not their job. That's your job. The job is to try to understand where they're trying to go and get them there. Now, every once in a while, that dot, dot, dot safely on the end of the motto there is important because sometimes your job switches and you need to dig in your heels and say, I need to be the lawyer here and I can't let you go where you're trying to go because legally it just presents too much risk, whether it's commercial, regulatory, or whatever it is. And we used to talk about knowing how the balance between those two things, knowing how to balance that effectively and have good judgment and be commercial is what earns you the trust of your clients so that when you say, I really can't help you do this, we can't do it, you've built up that trust and they listen, right? That's what's
Yeah.
important. And you need to understand the commercial needs to get there. So, along the way at Ascot, actually, was where I met Tariq and his team at LegalEase because there you find these tasks that are important to the business, and you look at them and say, this is a fraught issue. This presents some kind of risk, and there must be a better way of doing it. And I think I don't want to get ahead of our conversation, but this is the way that I met LegalEase and started to be interested in AI purely by accident. Kind of fell backwards into it maybe 4 or 5 years ago. In saying for particular tasks that are, let's call it high frequency, maybe not low complexity, but at least the issues are consistent and repetitive. There are ways to, even before OpenAI showed us ChatGPT, I think, Tarek, we met before that. There are ways to employ AI combined with people in a way that make those processes more commercial, more safe from a legal and a risk perspective, and faster and better for the business. And I'd say that that's been my focus in the area we're going to talk about today. And it's obviously growing as the technology grows.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Jeff. Um, Andrew, I kind of want to come back to you and you kind of went through a lot of your experience really hinged on documents and finding the right information in documents and having that sense of urgency that, hey, we have these fire drills and we need to get this information. We need to do what needs to get done within a very short time frame. I'm assuming all those experiences, all those late nights burning the midnight oil, helped craft what Catylex ultimately ended up becoming. Can you talk a little bit about how Catylex solved some of the problems that you saw in your legal experience?
Sure. And I think, what we set out to do was solve the very harrowing continual problem of dealing with volumes of legal documents and getting that data out. And that's exactly what Catylex does. So Catylex is an AI system that is extracting data from documents at scale with high accuracy. And the system is good for analyzing really any sort of document. So we have both financial and non-financial enterprise clients who do what I call is the back up the truck use case. They have a whole lot of documents. They may not necessarily know a lot about what's in those documents. They may have some, basic metadata about those documents. They dump them all in the system, and the system is able to basically tell them what all those documents are, who they're with, what the content is, et cetera, et cetera. And then in addition to that, obviously having come from financial services where there's a lot of, very specific specialist sort of documentation, whether it's side letters or derivatives documentation or private loans, syndicated loans, et cetera, that we've built capabilities for those particular documents. So that's kind of what we built to try and just take the pain out of not just take the pain out of process, but actually do things that were completely infeasible before. So as I said, in these crises that we had, it was basically impossible to do other than what we did, which is throw a bunch of people and still not actually get all the data you need. And the same with, when I was at the hedge fund with the side letters and the data that we needed from side letters, we got a very small portion of what we ultimately would need, depending on the issues that came up. So you go from not being able to do something and just, pulling out must-have data because it's very, very expensive to have, and you will not end up with great to have or nice to have data, which could be the must-have data tomorrow for whatever the issue is, right? So you can't write blank checks. You just get that must-have data. Now with the technology that we're offering, you can have the must-have data, you can have the great to have, you can have the nice to have, you can have a whole lot of other data, and everything becomes feasible at a pretty reasonable price point. And so we think that's an absolute game changer.
Andrew, like, are we talking about sort of taking what would have manually taken weeks to a matter of days or hours? What's the obviously it depends on the use case, but talk about kind of the efficiency gains from using a product like Catylex.
Sure. So, I mean, we can process the system will process about 1,000 docs an hour, assuming, a 10-page document count, a 10-page count per document. And it's funny, there's a lot of very long, like syndicated loans and private loans can be, 400 or 500 pages. But it's interesting when you get a large collection of any institution's documents, there are a myriad, there's the original agreements, but there are also many, many amendments and notices. And if you think about sort of, child and parent type documents, master agreements, and then, child agreements thereafter. And so when you average the size of all of those, we found just anecdotally 10 pages is not a terrible average estimate for a large population. But if you think about that, we can process 1,000 of those 10-page documents an hour. So if you have, 80,000 documents in 80 hours, you can have a huge amount of data with respect to all of those documents. If you were going to get humans to extract the amount of data that Catylex can extract from those documents, you're talking about multi-year efforts that would, in terms of costs, well, multi-year depending on the amount of people that you'd staff. If you could actually convene a group of humans to get it done within a year, you're talking, millions and millions of dollars. So it really is making feasible something that just wasn't economically or physically possible.
Wow. I mean, we have some very efficient humans at LegalEase, but probably not at the rate of 1,000 documents per hour. So that is incredible. Um, Jeff, kind of back to you. So I know you kind of mentioned that your first taste of AI and kind of automation with regards to your role was back when you were at Ascot with NDAs. Now you're at Clarion Capital, a different business, or I guess you're back to Clarion Capital. Um, I'm going to kind of ask you a question here. If you had a magic wand and AI could make your life easier or make the life of your team easier, what are some things that you would like to see AI be able to do? You talked about sort of high volume, lower complexity or mid complexity type of documents like NDAs, but what are some other things that you would like to see AI doing? And maybe you're already using AI to do some of those things, or maybe not, but what would your wish list look like with regards to that?
So I think the way to think about this is to separate, the different parts of the business, right? So I'm the last 2 years I've been back to being the general counsel and the chief administrative officer of a $2.5 billion private equity and credit shop. There are different areas that you could think about, whether it makes sense to employ within legal, which is, one of the main areas I oversee. I think, it functions as it currently exists. It functions almost like a very competent junior or mid-level professional, which is to say, if you want someone to look at a contract or a regulatory filing and, fine tune the wording, fine tune the language about how it's written to be in a generic sense better written, better organized, issue spot points that are relevant, in the ordinary course, having nothing to do with the particular situation of that business at that time in its life, given other things that are going on, you're going to get a great result, right? You're going to get improved drafting. You're going to get issues and legal context that maybe a person might not have thought of. You're going to see that a great deal. The limits in the legal world, I think, and why people still need to be involved are have to do with context, right? What I think a good lawyer, certainly a senior lawyer, but a good level junior, mid-level one as well, what they're bringing isn't just knowing that this word should be shall and not may, right? That's table stakes. What they should be bringing is knowing, I know the commercial interests and goals and fears of this business at this moment, right? We have a debt refinancing coming up in 6 months. We have a board meeting in 3 months. We're thinking about doing this acquisition here. We have perhaps this litigation threat over here, whatever it is. These different realities are what inform how you think about all the substantive issues in a real contract. And I certainly don't think there's any way for AI to do that now, unless there was some version of it that is literally doing intake of every bit of information that's going on in the firm. And I think there are people who've theorized an almost science fiction level of that. If you really employed every tool that was in Microsoft, 365, and everybody was talking on Teams and every conversation happened, perhaps, but that's not realistic. There are all kinds of examples you can come up with where an LLM or an AI tool won't, may see the context right in front of it in the wording that people are using, but won't understand it. Example we were talking about the other day was, if somebody looks at a business, we're in private equity, somebody looks at a business and they send each other an IM during a management presentation that says, this is interesting, but it's certainly no Salesforce, right? And AI might take that and say, well, they don't like this because it's not Salesforce. Don't continue working on it. When really it was a joke. It was a comparison, right? There are heuristics involved that just don't work the way that people do. And lawyers are with documents are certainly similar. They're going to issue spot things that an AI that just works on drafting won't see, which is why it remains in the legal world a tool for the low complexity, high frequency, contracts. For us, that's really at the moment limited to NDAs. For some of our portfolio companies, we own about 15 companies right now. For some of them, we're doing work to look and say, are there processes that can be replaced by AI, right? Billing and collections is a primary example. You can do that effectively with agentic AI in a way that three humans won't, right? It's just they can just grind it out consistently in a way that will save a business money and let those three humans go do something else, or let those three humans do 10 times as much billing and collections, right? That's a good example. Recruitment is another example. Call centers and customer services is the obvious one that everybody talks about, but it's almost like I was at in a panel recently where someone said we've banned the use of the word use case when we talk about AI because we don't want to talk about it as though we're looking for places to use it. We are looking for ways to use it in every process that exists, which is interesting. I don't think I'm quite there, but I think we'll get there.
So Andrew, I think Jeff definitely mentioned some of the limitations that he sees with AI, at least currently. We hear a lot about the importance of having a human in the loop, I think Jeff gave us some really interesting thoughts around AI, whether or not it can capture the context of conversations or intuitions that human beings would find sort of, second nature. Um, but maybe kind of looking at it a little bit more broadly, you've been in the machine learning AI space for at least 6 years with Catylex, and I know you've experimented with machine learning even before that. Uh, I think we could safely call you a pioneer in the space. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on what are some limitations that you see with AI currently in what you do, or in its application to the private equity or hedge fund space, and where do you see things in the next couple of years in terms of advancements in AI? Jeff mentioned agentic AI. Of course, that's something that we're hearing a lot about. So yeah, if you can give us some thoughts around limitations currently and where you see things going in the next few years.
Sure. Um, so obviously, with the advent of LLMs, people have embraced those, and they are very useful tools. I think the key thing that I would say though is there are horses for courses. You need to be careful and thoughtful about where you're going to use them. And what we've noticed is that we're operating in the sort of, document analysis extraction space. And what we've seen, and of course we experimented with these as soon as they came out, is that for extraction, there are some limitations when you use LLMs on their own, right? So one of the key things that you realize when you start using LLMs for extraction is that all the extracted data looks on its face very plausible. There's no obviously wrong extracted data. But the issue is when you scrutinize it more closely and check that data, you'll find that some portion of the results are going to be bad, whether it's hallucination or some of the other odd things that LLMs do. So what that means is if you want accurate data, and we're all talking about legal docs, so accuracy is absolutely important, you're going to actually have to check everything. And that sort of defeats the purpose of automating extraction in the first place. So checking documents and or checking everything may be feasible for a few particular data points for a few documents, but it doesn't scale across, as your document population increases, as the more data that you want out of those documents increases, it doesn't scale. So that's one key problem that we've seen with people using LLMs on their own. The way that we've addressed that problem is we actually run LLMs in parallel with more traditional techniques, machine learning, vector searches, and basically heuristics. And what we do is both of those different AIs are trying to get to the same result. Where those results match, we find that that's a high confidence result, and people actually don't need to check that. And where the results don't match, we highlight that in the UI and so make it very clear that users should check it if they want to check it for the use case. And what we find is that cuts through the problem of having to check everything. You're only having to check a relatively small proportion of the results, and that saves a lot of human time. The other thing that I would say, particularly for LLMs, is articulating prompts to get the right data is a non-trivial exercise. So when you're articulating prompts, you don't want to underestimate the burden of doing that. It's unusual that the first prompt you'll articulate will be successful out of the gate. It's an iterative process that can take time. And obviously the same is true with training of traditional models. Um, so bearing that all in mind, it'll be easier and you'll have a better chance of success with extraction, for simple docs that don't vary too much with few data points. And I think NDAs fit into that category. On the other hand, though, if you're talking about side letters, that's a much more difficult proposition, right? Because in many cases, managers are having to sign, the investor's form of side letters, and these vary a lot in terms of what they cover. And given the variety of what side letters can cover, there's many different types of provisions that managers want to be able to identify. And then you want to make sure that the relevant people in the organization are tracking and performing whatever needs to be performed. So, for example, our side letter extraction capability covers about 160 different data points and provisions, and we're constantly adding to that based on client demand. if you're trying to replicate that on your own, that's a lot of work, and you're not going to be able to build AI matching and all those things. So I think the takeaway from that, and a little bit back to Jeff's point, right? AI doesn't get context, right? It doesn't really know what your business is. So what I would say is, when you're looking at AI solutions, when you're in a business like the business that Jeff's in, right? Private equity, hedge funds, finance, make sure that the vendor is bringing subject matter expertise into the product, because the results you'll get, if that's not done, are not going to be fit for purpose, right? What you want, and at the end of the day, as Jeff said, humans are going to have to look at this stuff, but the amount of time and effort that humans are going to put in is a function of what subject matter expertise has been brought into the AI to really serve what humans need to look at. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andrew. Jeff, you're in a unique position. You're a general counsel, so of course you're not looking at just efficiency and maybe ease of use of technology, but you also have to think about liability, risk. Um, how do you sort of look at AI and AI tools with respect to data privacy, data security? What are some things that you have kind of uh, put into place or would want to put into place as you're exploring usage of AI technology within the legal department or within your role as a chief administrative officer at Clarion?
It's a really important question. So you need to be very thoughtful about what your business is and where your exposures are. We've talked a lot about NDAs, but that there's sensitive information that might be sensitive because you have legal obligations to keep it sensitive in an NDA. And there's other information that contractual that is. And there's other information that you have a regulatory or an obligation at law to keep confidential, right? Private, personally identifiable information, right? Social security numbers and things like that, addresses, ages, all that good stuff. Similarly for small businesses or large businesses, right? Commercial tax information. And then you have commercial data that's your own, that it's not about obligation. It's that you don't want this out there. So what that means, in its most basic form is before you choose an AI tool, the security element is obviously critical as it would be when you're hiring any vendor, right? Any of your vendor management, you're going to do that cyber assessment. You're going to do that security assessment. And there are different levels of that you might bring depending on what the tool is. There's one evaluation to do for someone who's receiving your data. There's a very different evaluation to do for someone who's connecting to your systems. That's a whole new level of risk, for example. And that happens a lot more now than it used to. When it comes to LLMs, the conversation is usually, all right, well, do we trust this LLM provider? Well, first you check the agreement with them to make sure that they are committing not to retain your data, not to learn from your data, not to allow that data to be accessible by any of their users. And most of the large vendors now say that's what they'll do. There's a constant discussion among people in this area about whether you should trust that, not because they're lying, but more because these are evolving business models, right? OpenAI is arguably the largest startup that's ever existed, right? Its commercial strategy is not fully developed. So if you use them, you might build your foundation for your tools, which I love ChatGPT. In my personal, that's what I use. But commercially, it's possible, they're a B2C business. It is very possible that down the line, they're going to have to pivot towards B2B, and whatever changes they make to their data retention, the way they use data, won't be suitable anymore. So you have to think about these kind of second and third level consequences when you do that. The flip side of that, which is just as important, I think there are a lot of people who don't want to get going on this because they're afraid of sharing sensitive data with AI. The risk, if you don't, is that your employees like AI and they might be using their personal chat GPT, whether you give them a tool or not. And if you don't give a tool, you don't know what's happening with your data, and you have to worry about data leakage. You have to worry about IP if you're an IP-driven business. So you're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. You kind of have to get going. It's a very tough, it's an evolving area.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. Jeff, Andrew, thank you so much for engaging this conversation this morning with us. I think we found it really insightful, and the different perspectives that you both brought to the table, really, really fascinating stuff. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Glad to
Yeah,
be here.
thank you
Thanks,
for
guys.
having, yeah, thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.